Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the outcome harvesting community. My name is Jules Geers and I will be your moderator today. I'm an independent consultant based in Belgium and I've been working with outcome harvesting since its very beginning. And I'm also one of the outcome harvesting community facilitators together with Connie Hoiting and Carmen Wilson-Grau, who will now also introduce themselves. Carmen?
Hi everyone, good day. My name is Carmen Wilson-Grau. I'm daughter of Ricardo Wilson-Grau. I'm also an independent consultant. I'm based in Guatemala and one of the outcome harvesting community facilitators.
Connie? Connie, are you there?
You're muted, Connie.
I'm sorry. Hello, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm based in the Netherlands, so it's afternoon for this side of the world. My name is Connie Hoiting. I'm also an independent outcome harvesting consultant and part of the outcome harvesting community facilitators.
Thanks, Connie and Carmen. So we would like to ask to keep yourselves muted and also to keep your cameras off during the presentations. We will have about 30 minutes of presentation, and after that we have time for Q&A. You're very welcome during the presentation to already put your questions into the chat box. And once we go into the Q&A session, then you're also welcome to raise your hand so we can unmute you and you can ask your question live, or you can put your question in the chat as well. Today's webinar is about using outcome harvesting to evaluate system level changes, and the two presenters we have here today are Genoveva Blundo-Canto and Nawaliyat Sule Adam, and they're both researchers from CIRAD. Okay, having said that, over to you, Genoveva.
Okay, thank you very much. So for the introduction and for the invitation to the webinar. So I am Genoveva Blundo-Canto. I'm a development economist researcher in CIRAD, which is the French Center for International Research on Agricultural Development. And I am here with my colleague Nawaliyat.
Hello everyone, I'm Nawaliyat Sule Adam and I work with the Innovation Research Unity at CIRAD.
Yes, so thank you for this opportunity, and we will guide you through a little bit of our use of outcome harvesting to evaluate what we call system level changes. So let me start by introducing, let's say, the type of projects that we work on, or specifically the project that we present in this webinar. So it's a climate information services bundle of projects. So it was not one project evaluation, let's say, but it was really a series of projects that focus on providing climate information services, which mean forecasts that are targeted, in this case, for agriculture, so for use in decision-making and planning of agricultural practices. And the project was funded by CCAFS, which is a research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security, which is part of the consortium of research centers worldwide, of 15 research centers for worldwide. And it was implemented by the National Meteorological Agency, ANACIM, of Senegal, initially around 2008, 2010 in small pilot areas, and then it was scaled out at the national level to reach all the areas of Senegal. So the features of the project are important to understand the type of evaluation that we carried out. So just to briefly present you the different details of the project. So basically, the project started by the recognition that endogenous knowledge, so the knowledge of local people in terms of how plants adapt to different weather types, to changes in the climate, what are the indicators in nature that they see to take decisions about the varieties and the agricultural practices that they will put in place. The project recognized, the partnership recognized that this was particularly important to target and adapt climate forecasts that would be more appropriate, more useful for use by these communities. And it also included a very strong focus on capacity strengthening, especially in understanding how climate information is produced, how the forecasts are produced, all the issues linked to the probability, the risk of the forecast not being necessarily exactly accurate for the specific zone of a farmer, and so on. So understanding what is the level of uncertainty that you can handle, let's say, in using the forecasts. It also used on-farm experimentation, so trials to understand, to evaluate whether the different agricultural practices put in place because of the forecasts would actually have a better outcome, a better agricultural outcome. And the project sent information through different channels, including telephones, telephone messages, radios, community radios, but also farmer promoters, which were very key to engage and interpret and guide the other farmers in the use of forecasts. And finally, the setting up of multidisciplinary working groups, which reunited different local agencies, decision makers, and so on, to discuss the forecasts for the 10 days, for the seasonal forecast, and so on, and take decision and recommendation based on these forecasts. So we can see that really the system of actors that were engaged in developing, transmitting, and using the climate information services, both at the local and the national level, was quite large. And when we look at the timeline, let's say, of the process, it really increased exponentially in the past, let's say, 7-8 years. So we've really focused on the fact that it's a complex scaling process with many actors. And so what were the evaluation questions that we wanted to answer? First of all, we wanted to really adequately understand, how did the scaling happen? So what were really the processes that allowed the climate information services to be used from the local level to a nationwide scaling? What were the changes in practices, in actions, and in interactions that happened because of the use of this climate information within the scaling process? And then we were also interested in the contribution specifically of the research partnerships, so the CCAPs and DANASIM, the National Meteorological Agency, and that of other actors in this in developing and generating these changes, and what was the influence of the context in this process. It's important to understand that the way we did the evaluation for us is really, it's a research project that has as a final aim, let's say, the generation of knowledge that is useful for different decision makers, in particular, of course, the scientific community, but also policymakers and the local decision makers, so that they can use this information to improve, change their practices. So the evaluation as a research project, it had two components. So we had one component is understand this evaluation, this outcome evaluation on the system of actors who developed, transmitted, and used climate information services. So we developed innovation histories with their timelines. We used the outcome harvesting within this within this session, let's say, on the system level changes to evaluate what were these changes. We used network mapping to understand who were the different actors engaged in the system. And finally, we drew the impact pathway of the scaling process. On the other side, there was another component. So it's really to show you that it's part of a larger, embedded in a larger research project. There was another component that focused on the impact evaluation at the level of the end users, really the farmers, based on participatory impact pathways and then quantitative analysis. So why did we choose outcome harvesting? So first of all, we were clients some years ago of Ricardo Wilson Grau. So it was our first experience with outcome harvesting. And after that experience, we embedded it in our yearly evaluation activities of most significant outcomes, especially in one of the projects that we worked on. But also the fact that it's a complex scaling process where multiple actors have contributed at different moments with different roles, with many potential changes that might have happened but were not systematized, were not necessarily known. We thought that outcome harvesting would really help us to better understand all the complexity of this process. And also something that I find particularly useful when we use outcome harvesting, there was no, if you want, formalized explicit theory of change, which let us quite open about the outcomes that we could harvest based on the contribution and their significance, and no, not really based on something that would be expected within a theory of change. Plus, there was no previous evaluation in terms of the outcomes for the different actors that made up this scaling process, so it made it really appealing to us. So I will let my colleague now, Elliot, go guide you through the steps that we've taken in using outcome harvesting.
Okay, thank you, Genevieve. To realize the evaluation, we went through all the 6 steps of outcome harvesting, but we had to make some adaptations. So we started by designing, and we set who were the main users of the results of the evaluation and their uses. And we set up some evaluation questions, which Genevieve already presented to you. Then we move up to a review of the documentation to formulate some preliminary changes. Another adaptation occurred at the engagement step, because it was, we engaged with the main implementer to enrich the preliminary changes. Then we substantiate, but also formulate new changes by engaging knowledgeable, independent informants through a snowball sampling method. And for the analysis and interpretation, we organize the changes accordingly to the content and the aim for the scaling process in each type. We visualize them by building an impact pathway based on the contribution of the project to the changes. And we highlight what we can learn from the experience as interpretation. And finally, for the support use, we run national and regional workshops, a restitution workshop, and we also wrote a scientific paper which is submitted to climate services, and a policy brief is also currently written. So I will go now in details of each of the steps that we followed. So for the designs, we identified direct users as the research commissioner and the implementer of the project, meaning the local National Meteorological Agency of Senegal. And the indirect users were the donors of research who will use the results as evidence to fund further research. The indirect users were also policymakers and other researchers who will take stock of the knowledge that we highlight from the evaluation. So here the evaluators was CIRAD researchers, typically 3 of us. And the evaluation was part of a mixed setting of evaluation who also have a quantitative analysis at farmer level. We then went through the review based on documentation that we gathered from internet. It was law text, project reports, brief notes, and we also take stock of the launching workshop, multi-stakeholder workshop that we did for the evaluation. Because during that workshop, the actors draft a timeline of the scaling process, enriched it with contextual factors and projects and actors which were involved. The next step was then the engagement, during which we formulated changes. We expected to have 3 types of changes. Now, the first type was the practice, changes in practice, meaning changing the regular activities that the societal actors made, changes in interaction, meaning new or changes in existing relationships among the actor, and changes in action, meaning new activity that the societal actor did on an ad hoc basis. So at the end of that step, we had 12 outcomes that were formulated, both from the engagement and also by taking stock of the documentation that we gathered. Then we went through substantiation. We use a snowball sampling method, as I said before, starting from the informant that the main implementer suggested to us. Those informants was knowledgeable. They were also independent, meaning that they didn't have any subordination nor financial relationship with the project or the evaluation team at the moment of the evaluation. And the interview protocol that we used was slightly different from a classical outcome harvesting interview protocol, because we added two components, meaning one about the description of the innovation story and one about the actual network around each informant. So the interview protocol started by the innovation story to get the informant, to get from the informant the connection with the scaling process and his contextual framework. And then we asked to those informants to formulate new changes. As they were independent, they were able to formulate, substantiate, validate new changes that they were knowledgeable about. We also asked them to explain the contribution of the project to those changes, direct contribution and indirect contributions, and to substantiate previously formulated changes. We also asked them to explain from their point of view what was the importance of the changes in terms of the final impact of the scaling process, meaning the adoption of the climate services by the farmers. So each interview were recorded. We also take notes inside of the guide. And to ensure the robustness of the information that we gathered, we made a follow-up by asking back to the informant to validate the interview transcript and to provide us evidence, meaning documents or any multimedia support of the information that they shared with us. Then for the analysis and interpretation, we connect the dots between the direct and indirect contributions of the project and other factors highlighted by the informant. Also also with the significance of the changes, meaning how the changes has contributed to the final impact, and also to the changes to build the impact pathway. So we were able to see a clear path from the activities of a project to the final impact as far as possible at national and local level. So the evaluation showed that out of 75 outcomes, 26 were directly caused by the project. And the diversity of changes showed that action were mostly taken at the national scale by national government agencies, while at the local scale, there were more practices and interactions changes taken by local governmental agencies, NGOs, and producers, organizations. So for the support use, as I said before, we ran 3 multi-stakeholder validation workshops, 1 at national and 2 at local levels, where we share with the participants the timeline, the impact pathways, and the lessons revealed by the experience. We also wrote a scientific paper, and we engaged in discussion with the funder of the evaluation and with the main implementer about the use of the results of the evaluation. So as an example, we can share with you some outcomes that we collected. So as formulation, meaning who changed what, when and where, we saw that since 2011, the Departmental Agricultural Agency of Kafrine, a local a region where the project started, formulates recommendation in the 10-day bulletins for farmers, technical services, and local decision makers based on the multidisciplinary approach of the multidisciplinary working group. So the significance of that change, according to the informants, was that the Departmental Agricultural Agency, which participates in the multidisciplinary working group, now disposes of a more refined tool to support, to advise producers. And also farmers use the information and they are in expectation of a bulletin at the starting of the rainy season for recommendations to schedule their operations. So the project has contributed to that change by establishing the multidisciplinary working group and also by funding the capacity building of the members of the multidisciplinary working group and the meetings that occurred annually since 2011. Another outcome is that since 2013, the Catherine direction of plant production has been using climate information to rationalize the planning of its intervention in pest-affected areas instead of intervening systematically as they did before. So the significance, the importance of that change was that then climate information allows them to economize on projects, on operating costs, and to increase the efficiency of their treatment. They also, the farmers also use the recommendation from the multidisciplinary working group to choose their seeds, and they spontaneously get in touch with the local government agency to request the climate informations. And it was also through funding and capacity building that the project contributed to that change. And now yes, January, if I continue with you.
Thank you. So,
sorry for my English.
So this is to show you a little extract from the database and the analysis. Actually, this is like a synthesized version of the fuller database that we have, but you can see we categorized the different outcomes and their significance in terms of the final impact that the whole scaling process aims to actually generate. The types of categories of outcomes, the details, let's say, the specificities of the type of outcomes, type of change that happened, the scale, the year of emergence, and so on. We classify the robustness of the evidence based on, let's say, the sources through which we could triangulate this, the outcome. And in the second smaller table, we also tried to analyze the results in terms of whether the contribution of the project, of the research partnerships, the research partnership was a trigger strategy so that it impulsed, let's say, the changes, or it was more of a sustained strategy to maintain a sustainable use, to maintain the use of climate information services for decision making. So basically, for us, the most important lessons that we gathered from this research project that involved using outcome harvesting as one of the tools that we use in this the evaluation is, first of all, is really to discern the diversity of outcomes to which the research partnership contributed. It's quite interesting to see how the first formulation of the outcomes with the engaged implementer of the project was less than half of what we actually collected on the field in terms of the outcomes to which the projects contributed. So it was 12 and then it was 26 at the end. And here it's just showing the different types of outcomes of to which the research partnership contributed out of the 75 that were overall identified by the informants. We also analyze them in terms of within each category, what are the detailed changes by scale and type of outcomes. So whether it was more for the improvement of the production of climate information that is relevant, creating new activities that change the way some actors are operating on the local or national level, and so on. And it was interesting for us to analyze the richness of the information that we gathered for the 44 interviews in terms of what we call transformation axis. So the different, let's say, what are the main trends in changes that we have found for the outcome harvesting. So we found on one side there is a continuous improvement of the climate information, so of this innovation. On another transformative path, it's really the active mobilization of different actors to sustain the process, the empowerment of some actors who increase, let's say, their agency in using, but also communicating, taking actions based on the use of climate information, and so on. So we really could analyze the different in terms of different transformation axes that this process generated. We were also able to reconstruct the impact pathway. So as I was saying at the beginning, we didn't start with a specific theory of change of the projects that made up the scaling process. Of course, we had some ideas, and that's how we started formulating also the first outcomes. But in the end, really, combining the different tools that we used in the evaluation, but specifically the outcome harvesting, allowed us to really reconstruct what were the impact pathways at the local and the national level, and to show on these impact pathways what are the outcomes, outputs, outcomes, and impacts, and to watch which transformation axis they belong. Also, when we did the restitution workshop, so we did this adaptation of rather than doing a workshop to harvest outcomes, sorry, we used the individual interviews, but at the end we gathered all the informants plus other actors that were interested by the scaling process to discuss the results, all our results. So we presented all the different impact pathways, the outcomes, and so on. And it was interesting in their reaction, let's say, to realize really the diversity and the width of the scaling process in which they participated, and the different transformation that it generated, and how they could actually see reflected in this presentation what they have experienced. And they also discussed the further improvements needed. So we really think that this workshop supported the use of our results for the local actors. So from the point of view of researchers, really, for us, the most important things was really this diversity of goals, actors, and transformation around an innovation, climate information services, which might be apparently simple. So it might be as a simple innovation, while it entails a complex process with multiple actors interacting, developing, transmitting, using information. Also, and this was in all the experiences that I've had with outcome harvesting, we could evaluate or harvest unexpected and unintended changes that otherwise would have been overlooked. For instance, if we would have been looking only at those expected within a theory of change. And it was interesting to understand how this process led to an empowerment of some actors in the process, particularly the farmer promoters, the community radios, the journalists, and so on. So adapting outcome harvesting, let's say, as a research tool, as we use it, the advantage for us is really this engagement with diverse sources, and having it adapted to start with the own formulation of changes. It can also have, let's say, the robustness of what we are substantiating if these changes are actually already mentioned in the first formulation of changes, and then we substantiated the previously formulated changes that were formulated with the implementer. The validation of the written outcome statements was also an important step to actually be sure that we appropriately capture what the informant was saying. And we really find that the combination of workshops and interviews, it really favors the openness of discussion and supports the triangulation for different sources that confirm the same results, for instance. At the same time, we found some challenges, which some are common already in outcome harvesting and many evaluation methods. It's harmonizing the definitions, right, of outcomes and contribution with the informants. So really be clear since the start to have this common language that we can use and understand. even though less is more in the principles of outcome harvesting, when we use it in order to better understand the system from a researcher point of view, it can be quite difficult to understand where you stop formulating and substantiated, especially the farther you move away from the contribution or from the activities that the one actor, for instance, the research partnership, have contributed to. So the more you have these wave effects and long-term transformation, the more the contribution is difficult really to assess and even recall with the actors. So I think that's it from our side. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Genovefa and Navalia. That was really interesting. So we're now going to open up for questions. And so I would like to say that if you want, you can also unmute or you can raise your hand and we will unmute you so you can ask your question. So even if you have put your question already in the chat box, you're free to also ask it by raising your hand. You will see a blue hand really below the participants. So that's, you can push that hand and then you can raise a question. Meanwhile, I also have collected some questions from the chat. So we will start with those questions. Okay, if you were already talking a bit about some challenges, but somebody's also asking specifically for challenges related to substantiation. So are there any challenges related to substantiation?
Challenges related to substantiation, maybe you can formulate it a little more. What do you mean exactly? Or maybe I can find the question.
So it's a question related to the challenges in substantiation. Actually, it was a question related to the challenges in general. But you already talked about some of the challenges. So in terms of the substantiation, did you have any challenges there?
I think then I will let also Nawalia answer, because she was the real substantiator in this story. But I think that the most important difficulty that we have found, as I was presenting in the challenges, is really being sure that you are being understood about what you are meaning in terms of what is an outcome, what is defined as an outcome, and really what do we mean by contribution of the research partnerships. Because sometimes it's easier, let's say, when it's really concrete, let's say, activities, training, or the setting up of a platform and so on. But there are other contributions which may emerge in the discussion, actually, because it's changes in mindsets and so on that happen because we learn something new and so on. So it's especially in the definitions that we had, I think, more challenges. And
and also as it was a specific cultural context, meaning that in Senegal there is not that much French people, and it was a bit difficult to get them really understood how we perceive the evaluation exercises.
Yeah, there is a language barrier or cultural barrier sometimes in understanding what an outcome is and why do we evaluate it in this way. So I think that this was quite important, like properly describe what we are doing and why we're using these definitions.
Yes. Can I also ask you, what definition did you, or what word did you use for outcome in French?
Yeah, it's a horrible word. It's a résultat, result. So what we do when we say, instead of saying results, we go directly. So what is the change in practice, in behavior, in interactions, in actions, and so on. So but yes, in the evaluation, in performance evaluation, and everything, it's always results. It's a horrible word.
Yes, so that's a difficulty with translation, right? That the words change a bit and sometimes get a slightly different meaning. My experience is also that in some countries they also use effet for results. Okay, thanks. And then there's a few more questions on substantiation. So there's a question here, if you could explain the snowball sampling a bit more.
You want to?
Yes, the snowball sampling, as I said, started by key informants who were knowledgeable according to the main implementer. And then when we interview those informants, we ask them about other informants which they know and whom will be also knowledgeable about some specific changes that were told us about. So it could be a new interaction that's occurred and about which we had to interview the new actor that which were involved in the process, and so on. So that was how the snowball sampling was made.
Okay, and did the informants know in advance what the outcomes were that you wanted to substantiate?
So I can
actually no. Actually no, because we had a guide, and as I describe it, the guide has 5 sections. The first section was about explaining from their point of view the scaling process, or describing the scaling process from their point of view, then formulating new changes for them. And once they are really how can I say it? Once they now understand, fully understand what we mean by changes, and if the changes that they formulate by themselves is different from those that we've collected, we now ask them to substantiate those changes, because we didn't want to directly ask them to substantiate changes before asking them to formulate their own changes.
The idea was, on one side, if they formulate the changes that they experience or that they know other actors experience, that's why the snowball sampling also was engaged. If they formulate these changes before we tell them what are the changes that we are substantiating, on one side, it was an idea of avoiding a sort of, let's say, confirmation bias. So let's call it like this. So if I tell you already the change, then maybe you say it, but you wouldn't think about it in the first place anyway. And on the other side, it was also if they formulate the changes themselves, and that change is the same as the one that we will substantiate because the implementer mentioned it, then it's even, it gives a certain layer of robustness, let's say, to this change already, right? It's really the first things, or the things that they thought about in terms of the changes that were that happened in this process. So it had this double purpose.
Yes, great. Okay, there's one more question on substantiation, and then I'm going to hand over to Michelle, who has raised her hand. So what did you do with the results of the substantiation?
With the results of the substantiation,
we built the database.
Yeah, we built the database. So it's a larger database than the one that we showed, because that one is like synthesized for the publications that we did. So we built the database, and then we categorized the different outcomes that were substantiated, and then that's where we started analyzing them in terms of this what would be the patterns that we see in the types of outcomes that were generated, and the contribution that the research partnership had in the generation of these outcomes. So that's how we came up with this transformation axis that we presented. And then we used all the information that we gathered, so from the innovation story, the outcome harvesting, and the network analysis, and the document review, of course, to build the impact pathway of the scaling process, right? So we had the outcomes, and we could link them partly through the results of substantiation, but also through the use of the documents and so on, to the outputs specifically of the research partnerships, and to the potential impacts in terms of the significance that substantiators gave us in their substantiation. Many substantiations.
Many substantiations indeed. Great. Okay, I think that then links nicely to the next question. Michelle, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Michelle Garrett, based in Seattle, and I was really intrigued to hear you mention that you had used outcomes to reconstruct the scaling up process in this research. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you did it, because it sounds very useful.
Mm-hmm. So mostly because we start with this innovation histories, which have a timeline that shows at one point different actors engaged in the process, what were the contextual events and at what point of the process this contextual event happened, and so on. So you already have a visualization more or less of the things that happened. And then what we did is, by using the formulation of the outcome, so when the outcome happened, who participated, how, what was the contribution, we actually tried to map the outcomes on this timeline, right? So the first visualizations were, we had this huge
Yes.
visualizations with all the timeline, with
Yes.
all the outcomes, all the possible actors, and so on. And that's, and really almost naturally, you see the scaling process, it really enlarges the changes that happen, the actors that participate, they increase the farther we move in time.
Yes, that's basically it. Because the innovation story was also really based on the outcomes that occurs within time. The initial project has triggered some collaboration among actors, which also triggered new activities. So it was, how can I say it? It was really a natural increase in the
and the trajectory of
the trajectory of the outcomes. So it was a clear link between the innovation story and the outcomes that we gathered.
Okay, thanks. Another question. So please feel free to raise your hand just like Michelle has done. So you can raise the blue hand below the participants, and then you can also ask your question live. You explained that one challenge was where to stop harvesting from waves of effects, considering that contribution of the main change agent was decreasing as waves go on. Can you explain a bit more, how do you trace exactly the limit to where you stop harvesting, considering the fact that long-term outcomes are often also very interesting, especially when evaluating system change?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a bit of the challenge that we face. That's why I'm saying it becomes more difficult when there is long-term transformation and this wave effects. But I think that because we did it within let's say a research environment, right? So we're really interested in describing what happened in the system, not necessarily because we want to evaluate some specific contribution or what are the specific outcomes. So that's why we chose, okay, we have 26 outcomes to which we can map the contribution of the research partnerships, but in total we had 75 outcomes, right? So it means all these other outcomes, they're part of the scaling process, and they describe how the scaling process happened. And the farther you move away from research, of course, other actors take over with their activities, their strategies, and so on. And the link to research is very feeble. Mostly, really, it was really mostly based on the interviews. So we tried to exhaust all the substantiation of all the outcomes for which the interviewee told us what was the contribution. When they told us they told us about the change, about an outcome, but they said no, there was no specific contribution. So we have all these 30 something outcomes, 44 outcomes that are not, that don't have a contribution. And we have them because we asked them to formulate first the changes before we substantiated. So it's basically that's the line that we drew, right? Once we exhausted the substantiation of the outcomes that had a contribution, we stopped. Let's say that's how we did it. But we could have gone on and on to substantiate the other outcomes where there was no contribution.
Yes. Okay. Great. So someone's asking, so the project did not have a theory of change, but did it have defined expected outcomes? And at the end of the outcome harvesting process, did you compare the actual outcomes harvested with the expected outcomes at the beginning or at different stages of the project?
Yeah, so what is interesting, really, there was no, I mean, when we looked at all the project documents that we could find, and we never found an explicitly developed theory of change.
At the actors level.
At the implementer and funders level. Yeah, sorry,
yes,
okay, exactly. That's what I meant, and that's what I wanted to say. So you had the theory of change that this project had. So it's a series of projects, right? It's really focused on the end users, the farmers. So getting the end users to use the climate information so that it impacts positively the livelihoods. There was no theory of change that related to the different actors that actually contributed and had and used or transmitted or delivered or designed the climate information services. There was no, I mean, even though the different projects participated in the scaling process, the scaling was always meant, let's say, as to have an impact for the end users, the farmers. But all these other changes that happened in the meantime in the scaling process were actually ignored, if you want. So, and for us, that was really the main justification of suggesting this kind of evaluation.
Great. Okay. And so outcome harvesting was embedded in a broader evaluation. How did it interact with the other parts of the evaluation?
So we had, so first of all, in the outcome evaluation, so the part that evaluates the system level, the system of actors that transmitted, used, designed the climate information services. So the outcome harvesting interacted specifically with the innovation history that we drew with its timeline, because innovation history is a specific tool that we use when we analyze agricultural innovation systems. It interacted, it fed into the construction, into the building of the impact pathway. So that is how it was integrated. It did not interact specifically with the farmer level evaluation. Also because at the farmer level, we had this first participatory impact pathway retrospective building, and then based on those results, we would design the survey with a quasi-experimental approach. So it was really embedded within these other tools, innovation stories and impact pathway.
Okay. And is it correct that you went from initially 12 outcomes to 75 outcomes through the conversations with the substantiators?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Okay. And so at a certain moment you say you had 26 out of 75 outcomes to which the partnership contributed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
So what happened to the other outcomes where there was no contribution?
They are part of the scaling history, but it's that we don't, when we did the impact pathway, sorry, I'm not sure if I have it here, but I think so. So when we did the impact pathway, there are, no, this is not the, sorry, I thought I had another picture. So when you look at the scaling process, when we analyze the scaling process, we analyzed it in terms of what are the parts of the scaling process, so its impact pathway, to which there was a contribution. So for instance, here we show where there was a contribution, but then in the analysis, so in the report that we have, we talk through the different outcomes. So actually the way we structure the report, we show the whole system with all the different transformation axes. So when we analyze the transformation axis, we have all the outcomes, and then we go into detail of the 26 outcomes on the analysis of the 26 outcomes to which specifically the research actions contributed. But as I was saying, for the remaining outcomes, they are part of the story of the scaling process, but they are not evaluated in terms of the contribution of the research partnerships.
Yes, okay. And so you always, yeah, and were these outcomes all outcomes in the outcome harvesting sense?
Yes, yes, meaning that they are formulated with a formulation part, as far as possible, a significance part, a contribution part. Mostly the 44 outcomes which were not visible in the impact pathways are those who are who are not directly affected by the activities of a project that we assess, but they have a contribution of other contextual factors, and they also have its significance, meaning that they somehow contributed to the adoption of the climate information services by the farmers.
But the definition that we always use was always changes in practice, actions, and interactions. So it was always outcomes in this term, in this definition.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And you also collected information on other actors and factors. How easy or time consuming was it to do that?
Typically, one interview has lasted 1 hour and a half. I think that it's an average duration of the interview according to Wilson Grau. And yes, that was the time that it took.
Yeah. It also depended when whether the actor, I think, where the actor was really closely, let's say, in interaction with the process, so they had a lot of things to say, let's say,
or no,
about the process.
Sometimes it lasted 1 hour, sometimes 30 minutes, but it was scarce. Most of the interview has lasted 1 hour and a half, and most of the actors has something to say, even about the innovation story or about the changes. Some of them are mostly at local level. Some of them are really knowledgeable about the changes for them. And at the national level, they are knowledgeable about the history and also some changes.
Okay. And so you talk, basically your presentation is about how you've used outcome harvesting as a research tool or in a research setting. So what exactly are the specificities of using outcome harvesting in that way?
So it depends also on what we are evaluating, but for instance, in previous experiences, I mean, what is interesting is that there is intellectual property rights, right? Especially on the research outputs. So often when we would have to provide evidence of the use of certain research outputs as an outcome, for instance, as used in new policies and new strategies for an organization and so on, that disclosure of information is particularly difficult, especially because when we used in the past outcome harvesting for yearly evaluation of outcomes, then these outcomes are actually published, right? So as outcome stories and so on. And so it's quite challenging to say, yes, there is a contribution of research, but I cannot show it to you because there is intellectual property right that protects it. So that's basically one of the main challenges, and we had discussed this sometimes with Ricardo in the past.
And also, as it has to be published, since it's almost a case study, and it's clear which country we are talking about, which innovation we are talking about. We also had some defection of participants because of their political status. They refused to participate in the evaluation.
But that, yeah, and I think that also applies to many applications of outcome harvesting. Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah.
Different question. Did you think about gender balance in the informants group?
Explicitly? Not really explicitly. No, because we had this approach where this noble sampling were depending on
who was knowledgeable about the changes. So we didn't had a, how can I say it, a quota or a how do we say that?
Yeah, no, not a specific.
Yes, you don't have a repartition or a frequency checking of the status of each participant. You just go with the snowball sampling to get as much information as possible for the evaluation.
But then, interestingly, one of the outcomes of this process is that one of the farmer promoters, it's a woman, and she became a parliamentarian elected in parliament. So, and she really considers that the trainings, the empowerment, the agency that she received for the participation in the projects were key
yes,
to her trajectory.
Yeah. Okay, and someone's asking, were all interview respondents independent, so not directly associated with the project? And so some interviews were done with the program implementation team also. So I think it's a question for clarification.
Yes, all the informants were independent, and but we had to engage with the implementer of the projects in Senegal, the local meteorological agency, because it's sorry for my English, because they had the documents that we used for the review step, and they were also knowledgeable about who were the actors which were involved in the project locally and also at the national level. But those informants didn't have any financial or subordination relationship, nor with the projects, nor with the evaluation team, nor with the main implementer at the time of the evaluation.
In fact, because the evaluation that we did, it was 3 years after the 3 years after the end of the last of the projects that composed this process. Even if some actors might have participated in the past in this project, but not many of them. They were all independent, either financially or in terms of hierarchical dependency and so on. And the engaged implementer, so he formulated the first series of outcomes. Then we had we validated these outcomes with the previous people who participated in the process from the National Meteorological Agency, but they were not substantiators.
No.
Okay, then I have one last question here. That's a good one to end the question around with. So if you would have to redo the evaluation for the same program, what would you change if you would change something?
I think that one thing is that we try to compare two dynamics of the innovation, because we have those region where the first region was the one where the first projects had started, and all of the actors were involved in the projects, so they were an earlier launching of the innovation in that area. And we also have another region where the innovation came really late. Actually, it started at the time of at the same year of the evaluation. So we have both of the dynamics, and it will be interesting to add another region where the project has started not at the same time, to have a kind of a control group of the effects that we observed. So that was a thing that we would add if we
would add more localities.
More localities.
But otherwise, we were quite happy with the method. We learned so much.
Yes.
Good, great. Okay, thank you so much, Genevieve and Awayat. That was really interesting. So we've come to the end of this question round. Before you go, I just want to point your attention to the next webinar, which we'll have next month. So on July the 21st, we will have Mariam Tadros, Michelle Garrett, and Malaka Arifai talking about how they've integrated attitude change into outcome harvesting. So an invitation will be sent out to the full community for that, but do write it down in your calendar. And so thanks again to our presenters for today, and also thanks to Carmen and Connie for co-organizing this webinar. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.